carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the cotton and
John Locke wrote in his second treatise of government that, quote, "Whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any farther obedience, and are left to the common refuge, which God hath provided for all men, against force and violence." It is against this backdrop that Virginia's history is to be understood. Roanoke Island was started in the midst of war, and was to be used as a tool of war, either through piracy or battle. 20 years later, the world had somewhat changed, but Jamestown's existence was realistically only a furtherance of that war, though its raison d'etre in this war would take a different course than the preceding Roanoke Island debacle. In order to understand Jamestown and other English colonial ventures after 1590, I need to lay out a few key points to consider. First, the Americas had been known for quite some time, at least since the Vikings had discovered it around 1000 AD, as both their writings and continuing archaeological evidence shows. Why did it take 500 or more years for the rest of Europe to explore the region? A proper understanding of economics answers this historical question. Most understand feudalism as a political structure that dominated European civilization, and they're partly right with this assessment. But it was more than just political. The system conquered the people by creating two classes, lords and serfs. The lords presided over a constant state of war. The peasants, afraid of that war, sought protection from the lord, and thus enslaved himself under the ruling class. Therefore, they existed only to support the lord. But around the 11th century, this econo-political arrangement began to change, slowly at least. Northern Italian towns that had been somewhat exempt from most of feudalism began to trade with one another, which sparked an early industrial revival and thus rapid growth. From that growth arose greater education and more highly civilized culture. The ideas originating from this culture soon began to spread southward into the Mediterranean, where other Italian cities carried the word to other European regions and eastward. It is right then to say that trade was lifting Europe out of the Dark Ages. When the Italian merchant came into contact with the East, a full-blown revolution was born, but this revolution, a free trade revolution, was soon to be overshadowed by the Crusades. Even though the Crusades raged officially until the 13th century, the merchants' power increased as new ideas, new wealth, and new opportunities could be so easily found. The greatest opportunities came from India, Ceylon, and China, where silk, jewels, and spices could be carried back to Europe. To endure this new market, the European had to create a peaceful situation in which to buy and sell. Thus, war and state involvement had to be largely absent, or no trading could be successfully accomplished. It is for this reason that the Germans saw a new possibility to become wealthy by creating trade fairs that would travel throughout Central Europe. This network easily found open markets, especially along the northwestern coasts of France, Flanders, and Britain, where the wool industry had goods to offer to their eastern counterparts. As is the case with any industry, the business leader is always trying to provide the best product for the least cost, and this is where the beauty of capitalism affects the world. The medieval capitalist knew of three main trade routes with the East: a mostly water route across the Mediterranean to Egypt, then down the Red Sea across the Indian Ocean to India, and then onward to Southeast Asia. Another route was across the Middle East to Baghdad and down the Persian Gulf, and finally the famous overland route, the Great Silk Road, made possible by the Mongols. It was the Great Silk Road that became famous by Marco Polo, who wrote about his and his family's many adventures along the dangerous route. To further illustrate the point that the northern Italians sparked this trade system, the Polos were Venetian, and it was Venice who sought to and did supplant Constantinople as Europe's gateway to the east. Further, as the northern Italian city-states grew, they began to establish the continent's first modern banking systems as money flooded into a one-time non-existent market. Northern Italy, therefore, became the center of all European wealth. But for the most part, this trade remained free, especially as the other regions became wealthy off of Italian successes. Yet by the 14th century, that laissez-faire system fell prey to increasingly common attacks. The first serious attack against this laissez-faire system was when the trade-loving Mongol Empire collapsed. The Chinese dynasties filling the Mongol power vacuum quickly closed the doors to Western traders, thus shutting the Great Silk Road. Prices for once readily available commodities skyrocketed overnight, affecting the Genoese merchants who came to dominate the Great Silk Road, and suffered mightily as a result of the road's closure. But instead of sitting idly by, the Genoese began looking for a better ocean route eastward. It is therefore right to assert that it was the Genoese who began the age of exploration. In fact, it was their desire to go eastward that fundamentally altered Europe's focus westward, as great explorers like Christopher Columbus theorized westward routes to reach Cathay. Another more serious threat to the thriving High Middle Age, early Renaissance European capitalist system came with a newly forming power base. Sure, the kings, princes, dukes, and other sovereign powers were always there, but many in the newly created merchant and banking classes began to jockey for their own sovereignty. Families such as the Medici or the Borgias even muscled their way into Catholic politics as a result, and even controlled the Catholic Church for a time. But the greatest threat to laissez-faire was seen westward in France and England. The French and English salivated at their newly created wealth in the wool market. Their monarchs attempted to abscond or divert all possible riches into their state coffers, thus halting productive progress in the region for at least 200 years as the French and English fought many battles both religiously and politically with one another, as well as themselves. In order for the French and English to ensure the greatest wealth for the state, they intervened by imposing regulations, raising new taxes, and stopping free trade with other nations. In fact, free trade was often forbidden as states of war were a constant reality. The Italian city-states, Portugal, and Spain were not exempt from the same issues plaguing France and England. Their rulers also saw opportunity to increase their dominions and began using trade as a weapon instead of as a tool to build the rising European nation-states. In all of these cases, the Jew, who was not allowed to own land in Western Europe, became wealthy through banking, but as time went on, the Jews often suffered severe persecution, such as the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, which were intended to rob Jewish wealth for the state. In fact, in the Jewish case at least, it was the state that often became so indebted to the Jewish because the ruling monarch wouldn't control his expenditures and had to take loans from the wealthy Jewish bankers. In summary, free trade was shattered, but not everywhere. The Northern German Hanseatic League was still largely untouched by Southern European power politics, and free trade would continue to reign supreme. That is until the heavily regulated and taxed Southern merchants came seeking wealth in Flanders. The Flemish wool market centered upon Bruges, which soon became the wealthiest commercial city in Europe by the 14th century. To reach it, an overland network was created that became known as the Hanseatic League. This league was a confederation of northern European centers, largely from the old fair circuit, that banded together to protect free trade. Thus, with the unraveling situation in the south, the wealth shifted northward from modern Belgium along the Baltic Ocean through Scandinavia and into Russia. Their system brought fish, a very sought-after commodity, and currency backed in silver, thus the British pound sterling still in use today. Other commodities traded included furs from Russia, wood from Scandinavia, and wool from England and Flanders. It is this way that Northern Europe survived the Great Silk Road's collapse. It wouldn't be long, however, until woolen trade became a state target. In fact, it was the British poundage system imposed in the 14th century as a tax that began mulcting incoming wealth to be used in overseas wars, mostly with France, who was also looking for creative ways to fund its own warring expenditures. Such a situation began to affect the English merchant, who began suffering tremendous setbacks and complained bitterly to the government, who then, realizing the situation, namely that poor merchants also meant no money would be coming in to support the increasingly powerful state apparatus, listened to the merchants and began granting monopoly status for a price. Merchants, the one-time enemy of the state, then started to use their new monopoly status to enforce their own tariff system in order to pay the taxes levied by the crown. In order to do this and still earn profit, however, the merchant had to raise prices across the board, thus ensuring profit, but severely damaging the wool trade at home. Further, English economic policy failures at home only served to steer the market into another direction, this time north of Flanders to the Netherlands. The Flemish were being closely watched by the English monopolists, which act hindered market demand until the free-trading Dutch took advantage of the still strong European wool market. The Dutch, then, became smugglers. As the Dutch expanded their free trade and smuggling empire, the English did what they could to combat the upstart nation. but they simply could not halt the smuggling flow, though the English did try. In an effort to stem the tide, the Crown created the Lord High Admiral and the High Court of the Admiralty in order to enforce English monopoly, at least in the Channel. This meant more taxes to pay for the expansion of government, thus hurting the English economy even more. Continental European domestic issues, as bad as they were, could not compare to the increasingly permanent state of war that set in as a result of mercantilist policies. Capitalist merchants saw scarcity, believed that they could answer the call, developed cutting-edge methods such as better ships, better navigation, better education, better roads, and better cartography, to name a few advances that benefited all civilization. From the 1300s to the 1600s, European understanding and technology rapidly advanced as needs and the new desires were met. The Portuguese were the first to benefit from these new advances. Prince Henry the Navigator opened a school in Portugal to train overseas merchants, who then explored down the western coast of Africa, some of the northern Atlantic, and into the Indian Ocean. Spain also took note of Portuguese gains, and finally hired the Genoese Christopher Columbus in 1492. Columbus claimed that the Portuguese had proven an ocean route to the east was feasible, but instead of sailing eastward, one should sail westward. They all knew that the world was round, but they did not completely know about the Americas. In fact, Columbus never knew about the Americas, even until the day of his death. Columbus landed in the Bahamas in 1492, explored the Greater Antilles, called the natives Indians, a name that has been attached to Native Americans ever since, and returned to Spain through Lisbon in 1493. But as Columbus arrived in Portugal, his discovery created a legal firestorm between the Iberian powers. The King of Portugal, desperate for funds, claimed Columbus's discovery as just an extension of an already claimed Portuguese exploration. The Spanish, who didn't care for the Genoese merchant, appealed to Rome, then governed by the Spanish Pope Alexander VI, a Borgia. Alexander answered the crisis in a series of papal edicts that became known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. The treaty only focused on Portugal and Spain, however, which fueled early tensions between the Iberians and other fledgling European powers. Essentially, the Pope divided the world between Spain and Portugal, but succeeding generations looked askance at the corrupt Roman legislation, especially after Portugal was occupied by the Spanish in the 16th century. This union served to create a strong monopoly on world exploration and trade, but the Spanish mismanaged it all. The Spanish monarchy could not keep out of regulating the merchanting business. As their overseas empire grew, and the Spanish created new governmental offices to govern new territories, as well as build new ships, hire and train new soldiers, and provision each outpost, they needed exponentially greater funds. Spain attempted to finance their agenda in a number of ways. They leased mines to the German bankers, the Fuggers, had lines of credit extended to them by Italian bankers, and then began debasing their currency, much to the ire of academic elites such as Juan de Mariana. Rising costs, as well as the Iberian, especially the Portuguese, inability to provide goods at a reasonable price and at a reasonable time, led to other nations attempting to carve out their own overseas niche as early as the 1520s. One such nation was France, who did much to chart the northeastern American coastline through Giovanni de Verrazzano and then Jacques Cartier. England remained in a political quagmire, as Henry VIII looked for an heir while also trying to navigate among the Spanish, French, and Holy Roman Empires. That's not to mention also the religious struggles of the Reformation. The Dutch, the other rapidly emerging European power of the era, ultimately did the most to crush Spanish superiority with its own 80-year-long war for independence. It was this war that greatly drained Spanish coffers dry by the 1600s. War, however, wasn't the only tool used against Spain. Academia, especially the school of Salamanca, was strongly against the Spanish crown's continued medieval practices of conquering and enslavement. The Salamanca school, of which Mariana as well as Francisco de Vitoria were key figures, devised peaceful trade absent of the crown's involvement as the best way to benefit not only Spain but also the newly enslaved natives. But such thought was squelched under the crown's weight, and imperialism continued as the rule of the day in Spain. Much of what occurred in Spain at this time can also be mirrored in England. Spain established Sevilla as her main port of call in an effort to firmly monopolize all Spanish trade, and the British, still attempting to control the wool trade as well as hinder Dutch smuggling, appointed Bristol as her main port of call. England also turned to colonization, not in the New World, but closer to home in Ireland. Smuggling was not really hindered by designating Bristol as the main port. In fact, the English attempt to regulate the wool market pushed the price of wool down and drove manufacturers away from guild centers. That being the case, the Dutch found a ready market among a newly burgeoning wool industry that had been decentralized across the English countryside. But that situation would soon change under the Tudors, who more aggressively sought to monopolize the wool market. Thus, the Privy Council was created, which operated above the common law system that had ruled England for generations. Also, the Tudors established a more modern governmental navy, which was intended to be forcibly used against the Irish. As the English military grip tightened on Ireland, so too did English legal precedent. One such office that would come to dominate these proceedings both in Ireland and soon in the New World was the Secretary of State, which was created to expand taxation, economic regulations, control Parliament, military ventures, foreign and colonial affairs. This new office quickly made its power felt both at home and abroad by affecting the fish trade at home, while intervening militarily on the continent. With trade already lagging due to increasing governmental controls at home, the English found it frustratingly difficult to be involved in European affairs. Therefore, in an effort to remain involved on the continent, the English government undertook a series of currency depreciation by debasing their coinage. The immediate results at home were catastrophic, as agriculture shrank, food shortages became common, and depression ensued. To fix the situation, the English tightened monopolistic controls already in place and granted new controls to the trade guilds. Elizabeth's accession to the throne did not stop the out-of-control mercantilistic economy. She made the informal policies of her predecessors formal and absolute. Thus the crisis deepened and spread. It is against this backdrop that overseas colonization became a serious discussion for the first time in England. In 1551, the, quote, Mystery and Company of the Merchant Adventurers for Discovery of Regions, Dominions, and Places Unknown, end quote, was formed, with the goal of finding new wool markets. It was an early form of joint stock company and was given governmental authority to explore eastward into Russia, which is why it was renamed the Muscovy Company in 1555. Russia was not the only target of the Muscovy Company. The English also sought to sell wool to the Spanish New World colonies. The Spanish did have a monopoly on trade, but they could not supply all their needs, so the English found it easy to smuggle goods into Spanish lands. It is under these circumstances that the English were introduced to slavery, which was a key part of Spanish and Portuguese successes on their sugar plantations. Thus, while seeking avenues for wool, the English began operating in the slave trade business as well. English involvement in these new lands, as well as their involvement in Europe, soon led to the rise of English piracy, especially as the potential wealth to be stolen was immense. Sir Francis Drake is the greatest example of these English pirates, but he was not the only one, as can be seen by the many seafaring examples attached to the Roanoke Island colony. Though piracy was a rapidly expanding business for the English, they still did want to colonize new lands, as was illustrated by Humphrey Gilbert, Martin Frobisher, Richard Hakluyt, and Walter Raleigh. But their exploration attempts were still heavily monopolized by the government, who granted patents and privileges to a very select few. Thus striking a balance between trade and privateering was very difficult, even fatal in the case of the Roanoke Island colony. The state did try to balance the situation, and the example for all colonizing attempts from Roanoke to the later James River plantation system was Ireland. The English subjugation of the Irish was much the same as the attitudes given to the native Virginians as well as future slaves. How land was granted followed the Irish system, and how government was initially established followed extremely authoritarian lines, though the Virginians had the benefit of being an ocean away, while the Irish were only a small sea removed from their overlords. After the Muscovy Company and Sir Walter Raleigh's failures, many of the leading merchants once again organized an overseas venture. In 1599, they created the Levant Company, which intended to monopolize East Indies trade. But plans quickly changed in 1604 after Elizabeth died and James Stuart from Scotland took the throne. James was tired of the constant states of war, especially with Spain. To show that he meant business, many of the merchants who aided Elizabeth against the Spanish were imprisoned, had lands taken, or were executed. Sir Walter Raleigh suffered all three fates. James also banned piracy and attempted to open freer trade. But the new king did not completely repent from Elizabethan-era ideas. He did see the benefit of New World lands for Old World markets. Thus, North American exploration was once again top priority. In 1605, George Weymouth, along with Ferdinando Gorges, the Earl of Southampton, and Thomas Arundel, explored the New England coastline. Upon their return, they petitioned James and the Privy Council for the right to create companies to explore the New World and plant Irish-style plantations therein. Raleigh, though in the Tower of London, was still the Lord of Virginia, and the leading merchants would have to pull resources together to buy Raleigh's rights, which they obtained in 1606, and opened the door to two new colonizing attempts in the Americas. James' government granted not one, but two new patents, which thusly created two new joint stock colonizing ventures. The first outfit was called the South Virginia Company, and it was given land between the 34th and 38th parallels, roughly Cape Fear, North Carolina, to the Potomac River in Virginia. It is better known as the London Company since the majority of invested merchants lived in London. The second company was the North Virginia Company, who were allowed to settle lands 100 miles north of the Potomac River. This company came to be known as the Plymouth Company, which is where their leading investors called home. These investors were different from the London merchants in that they wanted to control fishing and fur trading. Their colonizing attempt, Sagadahoc, began with a scouting mission in 1606, attempted colony in 1607, and abandoned settlement due to harsh winters in 1608. This was to be their first and last attempt at colonization, as all future investment went solely to the Newfoundland fishing trade. It is the London Company, however, that now comes completely into focus for Virginia history. Who were these merchants so greatly affected by generations of abysmal mercantilist practices and government tyranny? How would they be involved in not only creating the first permanent English settlement in the New World at Jamestown, but also in setting into motion the events that would ultimately spur later generations to rebel against their mother country? Now that we understand a greater background, one that puts the reason for Jamestown's colonization into better focus, it is finally time for us to look deeper at this fascinating settlement. A settlement that suffered under slavery, tyranny, constant war, was thusly forced into disobedience while searching for common refuge against force and violence. Thank you again for tuning into the Virginia History Podcast. For more information, please visit my website at vahistorypodcast.com. Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe on either Stitcher or iTunes and follow us on Facebook. And join me for the next installment of Virginia History.
Oh, Baba, do do ba des bi di do do ze